Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles.
We had something left over from Thomas Aquinas from the Middle Ages, from that perspective. But I put him in there to show how a 13th century genius who has studied Rambam, in Latin, still perpetuated some of the earlier rulings with respect to Jews and money lending, and who participated in the perpetuation of that notion of the Jew as the moneylender into the middle of the 13th century. Okay, but leave it at that. We know that myth still exists, and what can I say? All right, so what I want to do today is to switch over now to a very truthfully complex process of the blood, what we call the blood libel, all right, which is an umbrella for claims about the Jews killing Christians, particularly Christian children. It's a convenient umbrella because in truth, it began having nothing to do with blood. Most of all of the incidents that have been recorded for the 12th century, the 1100s, deal with one theme pretty much overall. And the first references to blood pop up in the 13th century. And it's very interesting. And I want to deal with this concept of the blood. The whole notion that Jews need to do something with the blood of Christian children. The most common one, believe it or not, that still exists today is the matzah myth. I'm sure everybody knows what I'm talking about, yes? All right. That still is operational, and I'll read some stuff later on if we have time about that, because I'm gonna do some weird things today. And we're not going to finish this. We're going to come back to this in a more, spend a little bit more time on it when we meet again after Pesach. We'll do a refresher. But then, because this is very complicated, I'm going to focus today on a couple of examples and some strange things that you may or may not know. But the initial association for that was that these things tended to be popping up surrounding Easter. Okay, the earliest ones around that time of the year. Now, the later on, they were not. But the earlier ones were around that time of the year. And, of course, I think you can immediately jump to the connection, the crucifixion, right? And so these stories that were told were built on that theme, that the Jews would kill a Christian child. An innocent, right? That's the whole point. An innocent child as a means of mocking the death of Jesus, who, of course, was also, in sense, pure, right? Blameless. And that would be a way of demeaning Jesus and the significance of Easter. Now, there is an interesting thing that you see that is referred to sometimes, and I don't know if there's enough information to really confirm this, but there are stories from Jewish sources about Jews in communities who would, at Purim time, would take an effigy of Haman and put him up on a stick, and they would have Purim parades, and they would march around with Haman on the stick, and Christians would see that, and they assumed that they were mocking Jesus. And the question is, what did the Jews think about that themselves? Did they view it as that? Or was it simply a mocking of, because remember, if you understand the Hebrew in the Megillah, it doesn't mean that he was hanged. It means he was impaled. He was put, literally a stick was jabbed up him. So in the point of carrying him around on a stick, it's making fun of Haman. But the question is, if this was going on, could it have led, because now remember, Purim is a month before Pesach. Okay, and these people don't know, the Christians around don't know what Purim is all about. I don't even know, I'm sure they didn't read the book of Esther or hear about it that much. Anyhow, so some people have suggested that may actually have, created a paradigm of some sort that led to this kind of a Jewish murder of children thing. But we don't know that for sure. It's not something that we can say positively, but it's a possibility. Okay, Tybal.
You use the term innocent children, and I just want to say, but given the serious doctrine of original sin in the Roman Catholic Church, which was the church at the time, their relative degrees of innocence, which would speak to that younger children would be more preferred.
Yes, of course.
No, but I'm just saying that makes even more of a thing.
Right.
Than this our bifurcated notion of innocent, non-innocent. It's the continuum, but having the focus be even younger children who would be less verbal, less in Piagetian terms, rational about what might or might not have happened. Right. To me, that had all sorts of levels of reverberations.
Right, and that as history goes on, you will find that as the focus moved away from this, the children get older. I mean, these things you got teenagers who are seen as the victims more frequently. So I think that's a good point. Yes. Anyhow. So I want to remind you that in one of the edicts that came down from the church council in 1215 that we looked at was that the Jews should do nothing in public that in any way demeans Jesus or Christians. Okay? Now they were saying that's not something that would automatically pop up unless there were complaints by Christian communities that the Jews were using public celebrations of holidays as a means of demeaning Jesus or the church. So, that could, one could use that challenge or that charge as weak evidence for the possibility that this Haman thing may have been interpreted that way, even though the Jews did not have any such intention. Or maybe there were cases where the Jews did it, thinking that they could get away with it because what would the Christians know? And the other thing you've got to keep in mind is some of this, the notion of Christian understanding of Judaism and getting an insight into how it works begins to, in the 13th century, begins to shift because you have some conversions, some of which we talked about, of Jews who had knowledge to one degree or another about Christianity and would bring this knowledge to once they converted, they would take the Jewish knowledge that they brought with them and use it against the Jews who, for one reason or another, they decided to leave. Now, the fact is, there's a guy in Spain in the 11th century who converts to Christianity and does just that. He takes his hatred of his former people, and usually these are people who were marginal in their faith. In other words, they were seen as being heretics and would have been, were on their way out anyway. But they became angry and hateful. And they let that out, and that becomes not an uncommon phenomenon as you move through the centuries. But the point is, and you have instances of this also in the 12th century. So even before the blood libels and the accusations of ritual murder, that's the other term, ritual murder, right? Before these pop up, you already have non-Jews, or let's say new Catholics, who are feeding negative information into the communities and into the authorities. Doesn't reach this populist level necessarily at the beginning, but nonetheless, doors are opening. And so it's possible that as few as these numbers were, that there were some of these, quasi-intellectual Jews who become Catholics who point to the effigy of Haman and say they're making fun of Jesus. I don't think you can prove it, but it's something to think about. Okay, it's something we're thinking about. Anyhow, so that is the first level of this process. And if you read the material that I gave you from The Devil and the Jews, from that book, you see how he deals with that, the different phases, the different stages. And that's what I want to sort of focus on right now of this process. Okay. I see your hand, Tybal, that's AJ. Sorry, AJ.
Are you asking? Okay, thank you. Regarding what you call the quasi-intellectuals. So, amongst the quasi, first of all, how widespread was this cultural practice of parading about with an effigy of Haman, and during what time periods? And then are you referring to people like, they were apostates and they were doing it sometimes for having been treated badly by their own communities, but people like Donan, I'll use that as an example, who were, for his time period, I wouldn't call him a quasi-intellectual, I would call him an intellectual.
I don't know. I can't say that he was I don't know enough. We don't know enough about him to say that. His arguments are are not that deep. They're not.
Is that because there's not material there to substantiate them, or was he just a very clever propagandist?
This is not a man who went down in church history as a man of letters. There are plenty others, and when you get to Spain in the 13th and 14th centuries, there you start dealing with people who had reputations within the Catholic community as being worthy scholars. Donan is a flash.
Okay, interesting. Thank you. Then following that, amongst those later 13th, 14th century New Catholics or New Christians, are you referring to, quote, quiet scholars, or are you referring to someone like a Torquemada?
Well, Torquemada wasn't a Jew, I don't think, but
formerly, yeah.
I'm unaware. His family was Jewish.
I think he was. I think he converted. I will double check that for you.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not aware of that. Check it.
He was. Yeah.
Anyway, no, they were both. There were people who were engaging, who would be critical of Judaism, as inadequate, but who did not engage in anything that was oriented toward something like what these ritual murders and blood libel accusations were about. Okay? And they were interested more in converting Jews than killing them. Okay? So, the other thing is the blood libels were very much populist in the sense it was more of a bottom up than top down thing, because and you can actually see the increasing weakness of the top as these things spread, because into the 15th century, popes would routinely.
I've got to back you up because I lost your thread there. The bottom, when you said bottom up versus top down, I don't have the picture.
In other words, I'm not finished.
Oh, sorry.
Yes. The notion, this is not an answer to your question. This is, I'm returning to an understanding of what's going on. The popes and the intellectuals at the top of the Christian Catholic ladder during the course of the 12th and 13th and 14th centuries uniformly condemned these. Nonetheless, the movements progressed. And it is suspected, not suspected, but you have many instances where local priests or bishops would be the ones who are fomenting these or supporting them. And very often the stories come from people who are not clergy, but they are they're, for whatever reason, they have some grudge against the Jews. And they take it out by spreading these stories, and so that's why I say more of a bottom up process. But the fact is, we're going to look at one instance in particular of a story that ended up with a trial and death of Jews, okay, which is also it begins in the 13th century. Trials and public uprisings against Jews are really more a product, for this reason, are more a product of the 13th century. There are uprisings against Jews in France and England in the 80s and 90s, but those seem to be more focused on the economic issues than they are on this particular issue. So, but it is a very, these stories are told and they are transmitted at a much more popular level than they are at an ecclesiastical level, let's say. It seems to be uniform.
So other than specific papal declarations, non-binding, not speaking from the chair, as it were. In other words, not maybe an apostolic exhortation, but nothing more than that, nothing ex cathedra. Then when you say the popes were more sympathetic or less anti-Semitic than some of their underlings, is that really just them putting out, is that sincere and a firm policy that was not being fully executed, or was that them papier-mâchéing something on top of what they knew was really happening below them?
All right.
And could you follow that with a comment on...
Wait, one thing at a time, okay? That's a good question. What you have here are letters. These are papal letters that have the same weight as any other papal decree.
Oh, that's not possible.
Yes.
No, I'm sorry, but there's the idea of infallibility only applies to certain documents.
I'm not talking about infallibility.
Yeah, okay. Well, that's significant when talking about Nostra Aetate.
That's a late phenomenon.
Yes. But infallibility is.
No, but what I'm saying. No, hold on. You're jumping around. What I am trying to get across is that these letters, it's the same letter, the same force that resulted in the Talmud trial and the burning of the Talmud in the 1240s. The Pope sent out letters to kings, right, to do this. Now, you can see here, by the way, an example of the problem. Oh, so you had the King of France, Louis, who listened to the Pope and did what he said. Nobody else did. The other king ignored it.
Well, part of that, do you think part of that had something to do with the Cathars and the papal problem with that?
AJ, I'm just explaining something, okay? So the fact is, these letters that the popes send out are of the same nature. And there are probably instances where, archbishops, people in the higher up would try to deal with these things. But the fact is, and no kings, by the way, you have one king, Frederick II, who chimes in on this, and this is around, 1225, 1230, in the 30s, okay? He denounces these, the king does, in France.
Denounces what?
The desecrate, at that point, it was a blood libel, okay? It was in the 1230s or 40s. And I believe, I cannot remember right now if it was a blood libel or just a ritual murder claim, but it was in that same variety. He says the Jews don't do these things, okay? But again, as powerful as he was, didn't stop anything because that continued. So my point is there were forces. Now, the other thing to consider, which I have not seen raised enough in the studies that I've looked at, you have the mendicant friars running around, okay? And they are whipping up a lot of anti-Jewish sentiment. And I'm not sure how, I have not seen anything in what I have read. Maybe somebody has looked into this, but I have not seen anything that has suggested that they may have been some of the people pushing this. But the fact is, it is the mendicant friars who are the ones who were pushing all the anti-Jewish sentiment that was inherent in some of the other papal decrees that were very critical and negative toward the Jews. So that you have that anti-Semitic factor operating at a populist level, just in a general sense, means that when these other stories start to spread, the communities are in a place where they're willing to, they're not surprised. That's those goddamn Jews again. So I would suggest that may be something that's, so to speak, in the atmosphere that pushed that forward. But technically speaking, according to what one would assume would be supposedly church discipline, the popes up until the middle of the 15th century are saying, no, that didn't happen. And I believe that was the doctrinal, that was the policy, okay? And one pope will refer to others who preceded, trying to reinforce their own position, saying, look, I am continuing what my predecessor said, okay? And what motivated them, I don't know.
Can you speak to the surrounding history of that period where you had inquisitions going on, not against Jews, but against non-Catholic movements in southern France, and the flagellants that you mentioned zipping up anti-Jewish.
AJ, stop. I was getting there.
Okay, sorry.
You're asking a lot of questions. There are other people in the class as well.
I apologize. I'll go on mute.
No, these are good points. Just let me answer you. Okay? The answer is yes. So one element is what I just said, whether it's directly related to this or not. Yes? The work of the mendicants. Yes, they were crazy about heresies. That's why they were given that power by the Pope. Okay? And they continued. Those are the ones who did the forced sermons. Those are the ones who were responsible for promulgating the use of midrash, trying to use Jewish sources to induce Jews into Christianity, and it failed. So they're getting very angry, right? So, I mean, yes, their anti-Jewish sentiment definitely poisoned the atmosphere. That was one thing. But there's something else that's at work here, and that is in the third, and this is, other scholars have noted this. I was just reading an article today by Professor Kival from Washington University. I think he's the son of a conservative rabbi, Chaim Kival. I'll have to check that out. But anyhow, and he makes note of this. He says that it is possible in 1215 the concept of transubstantiation, right? That is to say that the miracle of wine and wafer turning into blood and body, right, of the Eucharist, transubstantiation, yes, that became dogma, and it became a very controversial issue, right? Because a lot of people just couldn't swallow the notion, the notion that such a thing could happen, okay? And there were, and this seeped down, people say, to the lower levels, okay? But on the other hand, simultaneously, you have the spread of ideas, other forms of mythology, witches, okay? Who was it that spread plagues, things like this? All these mythological things, trying to place blame. And this was all going on during a period when you have a lot of changes taking place and a heightening of it. It's ironic because as the church opens up to absorb more philosophy and science, and so to speak, and even the universities begin later to open up and so forth, simultaneously in the masses you have more and more stories and mythologies going around, and it's almost as if this populist pushback is taking place, because these are people who are totally cut off from all that high level of culture, and they're living with this in this world of mythology, and that reinforces all of these things. But it is suggested that one of the things that allowed local church people, if you're, let's say, a bishop or a priest, and you are a believer in transubstantiation, and it's now 1260, all right, let's say, and you're living in France, and a blood libel has happened, and the Jews are using blood now for whatever magical purposes they need it, okay? By the way, the matzah thing doesn't come in until the 14th century. That's later. All right, but the notion of them using it either as a means of demeaning Jesus' sacrifice, or because they have certain illnesses. Some people, part of this thing, if you read the material that I sent out, is that the Jews needed blood because of circumcision. They had to compensate, and the only blood that could do it was the magical power of Christian blood. Okay, especially children, the purity again, right? So that's something that could heal that. But then later on, you have, in 1290, the first host desecration comes along, which is the notion that, I mentioned it last time, right, that the wafer being the body of Christ means just that. And so you have stories of Jews who steal sanctified wafers and take a knife and stab them as a means of demeaning and destroying the sanctity within it, and hence destroying the means of ingesting the sacrifice of Jesus. And the stories include, it's a coming together of both. Blood spilling out from the wafer because it's the body of Jesus, and the trail of blood leads to the home of the Jew who perpetrated it. Okay, this is the Bubba Mices that are going on now, and this is in the 14th century. But the host desecrations begin at the end of the 13th. And so some people suggest that this kind of mythologizing of blood and of the wafer may be part of this whole discussion that flows out of this dogma that was where there was a lot of tension within the church community itself. So that's what's, and so a bishop or a priest may be very prone to accept the story, because he could say, you see, even the Jews understand that blood and wafer are significant. okay, and that they are associated with Jesus. And these are material things. Remember, the whole discussion was, how can a non-material entity materialize like that? And so the whole point was, if the Jews are using blood, wine, right, and wafer, body, that means they're saying that they understand the truth of this new dogma, that Jesus, the transubstantiation, is real. Okay, and therefore using those things to demean Jesus, they know exactly what they're doing. Okay, and so that may be an explanation of the lax, if not fomenting it, the fact that these local authorities are pulling back from this because, hey, this is going to reinforce our belief in transubstantiation. If even the Jews can accept it, why can't you, oh Catholic church people, or my congregants? Whatever. So none of this is something that you can. These explanations are reasonable, are plausible, but it's difficult to pinpoint exact lines of connection, and I'll admit that. But there is no question that once the myths became part of the culture of the country, of the community, they perpetuated themselves, because clearly attitudes towards Jews over the course of the 13th and 14th century, they wanted to that's when the Jews were being kicked out, right, at the highest level, okay? And the kings who wanted them to go because they were the causes of unrest, were pleased to see this happening, because then they could say, you see, these Jews, I want them out of here, because look at all the hubbub that they're causing. They're supposed to, I mentioned this last time, the Jews are supposed to live in these communities that are highly disciplined and keep the peace. And now look what's happening. Their presence, the Christians are running around killing them. And when the Christians are going to run around and kill, that means they're getting excited and they're getting activated, and we don't want that. We want them to be quiet. So the Jews are a force of upheaval, social upheaval, rather than a force of law and order. And so these are all. They all sort of fit together. Okay. So I think it's a reasonable way of understanding it. There's no other. And again, I think the big thing is just the storytelling. The storytelling. People love to hear stories. And this especially, if you think the cumulative effect within the church of everything we've studied up until now, right? Their blood be on our hands, right? That which was unintended became dogma, so to speak, if you will, quote unquote. The Jews are guilty, and the Jews living in our time are guilty. That's what the church says. Okay, and that became, if you will, an official. I'm not going to say dogma, but few were the people who said that's not what this means. Okay, the popes tried to argue, by the way, that Jewish they did. And Frederick, I think, even says that the Jewish law prohibits Jews from dealing with blood. So it's hard to say. And even sometimes, I think Frederick, and I don't know if the Pope specifically said this, but Frederick, who was a more liberal, open-minded person, Frederick II had broad cultural interests. So he was more worldly than the popes. So he even said, the Jews don't hate people. They're human beings like everybody else, so they're not going to intentionally go around and kill. That's not part of who they are. And he knew Jews because he had Jews working for him, translating texts from Arabic into Latin. And he knew Jewish astronomers who were transmitting information about astronomy to his astronomers. So that was sort of a good thing. Anyhow. So these are the various things. So you can see the stages that it moves through. Yes, I mean the notion again. The first stage would be desecration, just making fun of the crucifixion. The second stage would be the blood, the use of blood for medicinal purposes. Then the use of blood and the stories of the wafer, again, as a means of demeaning. And all along of demeaning Jesus, and all along this notion that there are children, right? Children. And so these kinds of stories and that movement of ideas, and then ultimately the matzah, right? Which again, that I said that's 14th century. And that, by the way, of all things, is that and the notion of Jews killing Christian children without explanations. That came centuries later, okay? And the matzah thing, I'm going to read some stuff to you, that it's still alive. The matzah thing is alive and kicking right now. Yes, I'll show you that in just a little bit. Okay, Tybal.
Just short, given that I'm losing track, but wasn't it you that showed us or talked about the Notre Dame depiction of Judaism? Yes, thank you, Cheryl. As a woman, I don't think one can discount the inherent misogyny of looking at blood as a symbol, given that it's associating with women who menstruate, and the umbrella effect of then misogyny against women. I'm just saying, I think that's a piece of all this, that why the blood would have become even more of a focus, because it then makes it even easier to demean Jews as associated with women.
Yeah, I don't know. I can't answer that at all. And I don't know if there was any rise of sensitivity of that at that period in time.
Oh no, I'm suggesting it would have been a subconscious psychological association,
Maybe.
though the subconscious was made real.
I don't know.
I just think this is obviously it's looking back with a feminist lens, but it seems to me human behavior, that would be a piece of why blood became such a focus and now still continues. Like in the Arab world, isn't the matzah blood thing most active in the Middle Eastern Arab world more than the Christian world?
Yeah, well, that's right. But I think that has to do less with women menstruating than it has to do with picking up on that point. And in as much as, the how shall I say it? This is sort of silly, but there's always arguments in these mixed communities in Israel, okay, between the Arabs and the Jews as to who makes the better hummus, okay? I mean, I'll tell you right now, I don't want him to lose any clients, but I think I told you that my son-in-law gets his hummus from an Arab. So he stands for peace with the Arabs. No, I mean, because it's the best stuff around. Anyhow, but I love it.
May I just add something, an East Coast thing?
Wait, let me.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. So I think that it's an interest. You're making observations that I can't comment on because I don't know how psychologically, let alone legally or culturally, in the Middle Ages, women menstruation was how it played out in these things. It could have, but I don't know. So I really can't deal with that. Then I want to move on.
I can't just tell you one quick thing.
Go ahead.
It's about Israelis and Jews accused of cultural appropriation in terms of hummus, which is it's a huge thing. In Philadelphia, I don't remember how many years ago, a food festival that had gone on for a long time was canceled because of the idea that an Israeli restaurateur was culturally appropriating hummus. And then the second thing I'll say, I have a talk that I give for genealogy, looking at cookbooks as a lens for American Jewish history. So when I was preparing that the last time a few years ago, I was looking at journals for academic food historians, and one could not believe the vitriol and the hatred directed at Israelis and Jews in academic journals about cultural appropriation of foods like hummus.
Huh.
Rabbi, I have a quick question, and then I'm leaving, if that's okay.
No, you may not leave.
I know. I get a brownie. There's no brownie point. Okay. I do have a 1:00 Zoom, but I wanted to come. I'm surprised the Jews at this time did not counter with saying to the Christians, your whole idea of the Eucharist is reeks of cannibalism. I mean, the idea, there's nothing in Judaism like this. We have nothing that I know of in Judaism.
I have an answer. They did.
Okay.
They did.
Oh, good.
They did. No, if you read the books, these polemics against, but again, they're books, and they are books very critical. You need to have a background to read these books. So in a sense, the population, it would require rabbis reading those books and translating them down, to the population. But the notion that Christians would read these books and learn from them, no. I mean, there were instances. There are references in these polemics. I mean, I studied them. I've written about this, where Jews and bishops or Jews and priests go into dialogue, and they will discuss these things. Okay? And the Jew will make points where he will say, I mean, one example of that, it's Milchamot Hashem. That's the name of the book, 13th century France, southern France, 1230s, something like that, okay? That's a very popular name, The Wars of the Lord, okay? And so I really believe this happened. This particular rabbi and the local bishop are friends. They talk a lot. So one day the bishop asks, why do you hate us? The rabbi says, we don't hate you. Why do you think that? Well, you charge us interest, but you don't charge yourselves interest. I mean, how can you explain that? So he says, look at it. The rabbi says, look at it this way. In theory, in fact, if you read the Bible, at one point it says, and he picked up on a good point here, that it is among the interest, Jews may not charge interests of poor people. It says so. And that's the original intent, all right? But more and more, Jews were in contact with non-Jews. And this is, again, he doesn't know the history here, but I mean, he was correct. Deuteronomy changes that and says you may charge interest from a non-Jew, but not a Jew. No Jews. It's a change. Why? Because by the 7th century or 6th century, when that book was finally put together, Jerusalem, for different periods of time, had become a sort of a trade center when it was a bigger city. Okay? And so Deuteronomy had to take that into account. The same reason why Nehemiah in 450 tells the Jews, tells the people from Tyre, the Phoenicians, no more doing business by the gates of the city on Shabbos. Doing business on Shabbos is verboten. That was a halachic chidush. And from that point on, business on Shabbos was forbidden. Okay, but he's dealing with pagans who are out there doing business. So that process developed. It, obviously with fits and when the temple was destroyed, I guarantee you there were very few non-Jews running around doing business because there was a war going on. Okay, but at different times in different locations, throughout the period of the putting together of the book of Deuteronomy, urbanization had grown. And so there were relations with itinerant merchants, non-Jews, who went through. And they would borrow money, and they would go, let's say they came down from Mesopotamia, borrowed money, went to Egypt, did business, and came back, and they had to repay the loan. So the Jew's money was with him for, let's say, 3 months. He came back. All right, the Jew was without that money. So he said, I got to charge you. Fine. It was interest. Okay. So now the rabbi is trying to explain it's not that we hate you. It's just that the family, think about a family. Do you not treat your family with a little higher respect of love than you do people who are not part of your family?
That's
I
right.
know you as a bishop love everybody, but look, let's be honest. Your family is your family.
Right.
So we view the Jewish, that's our mishpacha.
Right.
So you're not part of the mishpacha. Doesn't mean we hate you. It just means we're more strict on ourselves.
Not to mention that you guys don't treat us well and give A, B, C, D. I mean,
right? No, but this particular bishop was treating the Jews well.
Okay.
I mean, he personally, there were instances like that,
Yeah.
But that's an example. So yes, I mean, there were. We don't know how often this happened. There are little stories of discussions about Christianity and Judaism, blah blah blah, in many of these books, because these Jews were interacting with Gentiles. So there's one family from the 12th into the 13th century. Their name is official, because they've served as officials in the royal court. That's what the popes were yelling about. We read that in one of the papal decrees. Jews can't serve as officers in the church, right? This is in 1215, this is the ruling, which means it was going on. So you had stories of these discussions. So the answer is, to some degree, that went on. But the point is, it didn't change anything, because the Jews were powerless. They had no vehicle to put pressure. In a way, they were totally dependent on the kings, in some cases, bishops were the governors of the city. There were bishops who had two hats, religious and secular. And they were okay. They wanted the Jews there for practical purposes, right? But the Jews couldn't say, okay, we're going to go on strike. All right, do you really want to do that? You're going to be able to pay your taxes to me if you go on strike?
And the Maccabees as a role model, they never considered forming groups of soldiers to fight.
Soldiers fighting? What do you mean? Their numbers were so small.
Well,
there was not. No. I mean, look, people say the rule was Jews can't carry swords. Right? That pops up late in Germany. We know about that in the 13th century. But the century before that, there are pictures of Jews from that time. Ancient pictures of Jews, medieval pictures of Jews with swords. They were carrying swords. Sure, they were. But it's like saying, if the Jews in Topeka, Kansas got up and tried to rebel against the mayor, what would happen? They'd all be thrown in jail. All right? How many Jews are in Topeka, Kansas?
Ask Ron Wolfson.
He's not living in Topeka, Kansas anymore, my dear.
But he keeps up with it.
All right, the point is, think about it in those terms. The only place where you could conceivably imagine Jews picking up arms, perhaps, and it would have been, let's say, in certain communities. But when those 1391 pogroms broke out, the numbers were just they couldn't do anything.
Well, I'm going to say goodbye, but my thing is, I bet if these people could do it over again, I'm just, that better off trying. That's all I'm going to say. Because
no, the point is, but you've got to. It's hard for us to put ourselves into the mindset of people in the Middle Ages.
Of course. No, it's very difficult. It's very difficult to, I understand but I'm just saying, I think, do you think they had a dangerous naivete, or were they just so powerless? Do you think they had any idea what was coming? I mean, overall, in terms of the
At a certain point, they probably did, but the best that they could do is try to prevent Jews preventing other Jews from engaging too much in something that may be undermining of the community.
Right.
But short of that, no, they didn't have enough power. Anybody who says they did, the Maccabees were able to succeed when they did because there was another factor at play that ultimately took the power of the Greeks away from, that would be either Rome or the Persians.
Okay, so they had help.
At that point, it was more Rome, right? And they had bigger fish to fry. Let's be honest about it. Antiochus IV, okay, ultimately gets killed in battle with the Romans, and when he dies, everything's, that was the end of that persecution, and the Maccabees took over because there was weakness in the court, up northeast. Okay, there was weakness. Had they been as strong as they were before, probably would have. I mean, they had good guerrilla warfare. I mean, the Maccabees were very smart in how they fought that war. There's no question about it. Okay, and it's the same thing. The Romans, when they conquered Israel, they already controlled it, but when they put down the revolt in 66 to 70, there were more towns that just caved into the Romans than fought back. This we know. Okay, because the numbers, the power Jerusalem was different, but Jerusalem, unfortunately, caved in internally because of all the internecine fighting that was going on. But the bottom line is, even Jerusalem would have fallen, as it did. I mean, but that war was a small war because of the weakness of the Jewish community throughout the country. You want to see a real war? The Bar Kokhba revolt. All right, and you know what happened at the end of that? That lasted for 3 years. And you know what happened in Eretz Yisrael?
It didn't go well, right?
Horrible.
Right. I have to
diminished hugely.
No, it's terrible.
And they all ended up in the Galilee.
Right. No, it's terrible.
And okay, Rabbi. Off base. And
thank you. Thank you so much.
All right. Yes. So goodbye. I will see you. Bye. I'm not finishing yet, but you have to go.
Good to see all of you. Thank you so much, Rabbi. Bye.
We'll see you in April.
Thank you.
April. Okay. Bye. Okay. All right. Anyway, so what I want to do, I'm just going to take just for the, for the heck of it, I have this. I pulled off of the article from Wikipedia, a whole thing. I'm going to jump now to the, this is one page I'm going to read to you. This is a page from the Wikipedia article dealing with, I'm in 2014, guys. Okay, this is not the Middle Ages, as far as we know. All right, I'm just going to read the text here, okay? In an interview which aired on the Al-Quds TV channel on 28 July 2014, as translated by Memory, and Memory does a very good job of translating things, Osama Hamdan, the top representative of Hamas in Lebanon, stated that we all remember how the Jews used to slaughter Christians in order to mix their blood in their holy matzos. By the way, he didn't say matzot, he said matzos, the same way the Ashkenazim say it. He must have been a good, wonderful Ashkenazic Hamas person. This is not a figment of imagination or something taken from a film. It is a fact acknowledged by their own books and by historical evidence. In a subsequent interview with CNN's Wolf Blitzer, Hamadan defended his comments, stating that he has Jewish friends. Okay. Now, moving on, later that year, in a sermon broadcast on the official Jordanian TV channel on 22 August 2014, Sheikh Bassam Amouche, a former minister of administrative development who was appointed to Jordan's House of the Senate in 2011, stated, as translated by memory, in the Gaza Strip, we are dealing with the enemies of Allah, who believe that the matzos that they bake on their holidays must be kneaded with blood. When the Jews were in the diaspora, they would murder children in England, in Europe, and in America. They would slaughter them and use their blood to make their matzos. They believe that they are God's chosen people. They believe that the killing of any human being is a form of worship and a means to draw near to their God. Okay? Then, of course, we have April 27, 2019. You know about this. It's close to home. John Ernest entered Poway Synagogue in Poway, California, and fatally shot one woman and injured 3 other people, including the synagogue's rabbi. In the manifesto that is attributed to him, he wrote that he was avenging, get this, the martyrdom of Simon of Trent. The Simon of Trent became a cause célèbre. It happened in 1475, and the arrest and punishment of the Jews took place in 1478. That's when that happened, okay? So he wrote regarding that he was avenging the martyrdom of Simon of Trent, which is in Italy. You are not forgotten, Simon of Trent. The horror that you and countless children have endured at the hands of the Jews will never be forgotten. Simon, of course, was the victim in that blood libel. Okay, so this guy, this is 2019. Okay, and then you have in March 2020, Italian painter Giovanni Gasparo unveiled a painting of the martyrdom of Simon of Trent titled Martirio di San Simonio da Trento per omicidio rituale ebraico. Did you get those last few words? The ritual homicide of the Hebrews, of the Jews. That's the title. Okay? The painting was condemned by the Italian Jewish community and the Simon Wiesenthal Center, among others. And finally, on this page, the QAnon conspiracy theory has been accused of advancing blood libel tropes through its belief that Hollywood elites are harvesting adrenochrome from children through satanic ritual abuse in order to become immortal. In February 2022, a sculpture of Simon of Trent depicting the blood libel was used to promote the adrenochrome harvesting conspiracy theory. So that's 3 years ago. The point being, as you can see, in all of these instances, and some would say some of this is marginal, blah, 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 but, when you read this stuff and you see this, these stories are still alive. It's amazing. And you know that there was a blood libel. There was a blood libel in New York in 1928. There was a girl who was a teenage girl, non-Jew, disappeared. And people began to talk about it, and they said the Jews killed her and used her blood. 1928 in New York. Well, it turns out she turned up 2 days later and said, no, I wasn't kidnapped by the Jews. They didn't touch me. I lost my way. And you would have thought that would have ended it. But there were people who said, no, they did it because she said that because they threatened her life. And it happened. They really were going to do it, but somehow she got away. They couldn't believe that in fact it didn't happen. But this in New York, 1928. Okay. And I'm not going to even begin to start talking about all the stuff that happened in the 19th and in the 19th and 20th centuries. There is a consistent pattern of transmitting these ideas and generalizing from them. I mean, it's horrible that humankind operates this way, and it's in various places. A lot of stuff, this all began in Western Europe, but from the 17th century on, it begins to pop up in Eastern Europe, in Poland, and then, of course, in Russia. I mean, into the 21st century in Russia, it's still going on. Again, it's not like this is headline news every day. We're not talking about that. But there's this substratum of popular culture that perpetuates these things. And, ultimately, the whole, I see you in just a second. Let me finish this point, Cheryl. I mean, as you've seen, and I don't want to overly, simplify here, but if you keep in mind the notion that everything that I have read now has come from either Christian or Muslim sources, right? And by the way, some of these Muslim sources also cite as verification of the general place where Jews are, of course, the very important historical work of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which we will talk about when we come back. You're going to be reading some sections from that when we come back in the spring. But that I told you, the Hamas Charter includes that specifically as a fine historical work if you want to learn about the Jews. Okay, so that's another one of these things. That's a biggie. I mean, because that was published and still is being published and disseminated, mainly in the Arab world, but not just there. Anyway, but the point is, though, that these stories come from Muslim and Christian sources. And again, it's just a continuation of this, the issue of the ambivalence that these major religions have toward the mother religion, if you will. Okay, and it's hard to see how, given the degree to which it permeated their sacred sources, even if you can interpret that historically, right, and understand why that happened, doesn't matter. Once you go into a few, a generation or two beyond that, becomes dogma. And that's the sad thing, that this garbage has almost reached the role of dogma in certain circles within these huge billions of people, and it's a real problem. And you wonder, how could the world have stood by and watched the Holocaust? It's just the Jews. Then you think about it, and I'm not one. I used to not be. I mean, I've studied this. I've taught this for a long time, and what's going on right now is something that 20 years ago I couldn't have imagined. But over time you see how things begin to erode, and all kinds of other factors come into play. And we'll talk about that more when we deal with the modern period. It's not simple. It's not simple. And the thing is, it's popping up now in places where it shouldn't be. That's what we were just talking about, right? And what Tybal was mentioning about this craziness, because Jews are serving Arab food, they're stealing it from them. So what? I mean, when did that become a cultural crime? Well, it's to Jews. It just makes no sense. Well, it does, if you see that these ideas float around, and it's very frustrating. Yeah. Okay. Questions? Anybody right now? Go. I'm sorry, Cheryl. Go ahead.
It's okay. I have so many things floating around in my head. I have a hard time picking one. But when Jacqueline raised the question about our powerlessness throughout history, that's what's sitting on me right now. And I'm thinking about, how does one arm oneself against conspiracy thinking? I mean, this is conspiracy thinking. Like, how do you battle? You don't battle it with a sword. So, we've had, I have one other thing I just have to say, that in 1920s, in Atlanta, we had a lynching of a Jew, Leo Frank, the Leo Frank case. You know
Oh, yeah,
that?
of course. I've heard it. Yeah, right. Was that because
Yeah.
of the blood libel?
Not exactly. He was accused, it had a sexual element. He was a manager of a pencil factory, and he was accused of murdering a child. And there was a deathbed confession in the 1980s of the person who actually did murder the child, who was an employee in the pencil factory. So it wasn't him. But this was about the same time as the New York thing. So it wasn't so unusual. But I mean, this is the kind of thing people were willing to believe that an evil Jew would take an innocent little girl.
Right. That's a
And
spin-off.
they
Right.
didn't, I don't think they said he raped her, but they said he murdered her.
Yeah.
And but this is the kind of thinking, and conspiracy theories are so popular now. They influence people, all kinds of people we think are intelligent believe very strange things.
Yes.
So why can't they believe this too right now?
Yeah.
And what sword do we have? I just am throwing that there. I don't know what to do.
No, it's a complicated thing that you're dealing with. The problem is today, and it probably has always been the case. Social issues are not simple, but everybody wants simple answers, right? And when today, science is seen as being ridiculous, even though reasonable people will understand that it's the best answer you have for dealing with issues until somebody comes up with a valid, proven, different perspective, right? And so that's you would expect that people would just understand that. But no, the myth supersedes the reality. And you end up living in a world of unreality. And because that's where you find your comfort zone in being afraid and angry, but that becomes your comfort zone. And because that's the world around you, so you try to explain it simplistically. And everybody wants to have an easy answer. That's the problem. What is the problem? That's the problem. Oh, yeah, that makes good sense. And that's human nature, unfortunately. And it's clear that that's an element of human nature that you would have thought at different points in time. But listen to this. I mean, it's almost a replay. The 12th and 13th centuries in Western Europe was what was called the Enlightenment of the Middle Ages. At the upper levels, at the upper crust, you had science, philosophy, literature, linguistics, all kinds of studies going on that had profound impacts going forward on those fields. Okay? And this is before the Renaissance. This is called the Renaissance of the 12th century. Okay, it's not identical. But all this stuff was going on. I mentioned Thomas Aquinas. He studied Aristotle. Right? And he used the Rambam as a means of understanding how to translate Aristotle into a monotheistic religion. Okay, that's amazing. Right? Simultaneously, this garbage was going on. And, people were being killed for all kinds of reasons. People were being blamed for all kinds of things because you had a destabilization, number one, taking place in economies, but number two, because religious forces were being unleashed that heretofore had been controlled. And it's interesting that the Muslims preceded the Christians, the Catholics in this, because their crazy right-wing crazy people were already active in the late 11th and into the 12th centuries. Why did Rambam leave Spain? Because of the Muwahhidin, the extreme Muslim group they were running the town. They were running the show down there. And they said, if you don't become Muslim, either get out of here or you're going to die or convert. But you cannot be here and not be a Muslim. Family left. Okay. So that's going on around the same time when you have all this great culture going on in Spain itself up north. Okay. But the Jews in the Islamic community had this going on up until around 1100. Tremendous interchange between Jews and Muslims in Spain culturally. right? And that's when you have Jewish linguistics, poetry, astronomy, all these areas that ultimately are transferred. Interestingly, the Jews, a lot of the stuff was transferred into Europe and helped build that process in Europe into the 13th century. But then the same thing happened over there, right? With the friars running around, okay? And destabilization taking place in many places, all right? And so life becomes complex, troubles, and then you get plagues, and this and that, and the other thing in the 14th century. So it's ironic. It's like today. You had this burst of, I'm thinking the last 30 years, with electronics. It changed the world. It was like, it's almost the same as the Industrial Revolution. And the same thing happened then, in a sense, right? If you think about it. And the problem is, what you have is when that's all happening, there's a whole ton of people, the majority of the people in the Middle Ages, who had no contact with all that. And so it couldn't trickle down to them. So I think that's part of what our dilemma is. Okay, and you can't. It's hard to talk to people when the myth takes over. It's a challenge. It really is. Okay, so what else? I mean, while you got me, okay, all right, yeah.
That was good. Thank you.
Well, I mean, it's frustrating. It's frustrating when you want to have an open mind and try to, understand things and, rationally and reasonably and respectfully. And, it's still, I mean, thank God there are still rabbi priest groups going on, where we talk to one another. And here in Los Angeles, that has been a very positive force for, dialogue, and it still operates. But we need more of those things. It's easier today around the world, in most places, to talk to Christians than it is to talk to Muslims. Okay, and in summary, it's very interesting. Depending upon your orientation as a Jew, I mean, Orthodox Jews probably have. It's very easy for them to talk to evangelical Christians, right? Well, where they respect one another, and that's a good thing. That's fine because they're both fundamentalists, right? And they're going to both look at the Hebrew Bible the same way. And the Jew will simply say, "Well, our midrash is this way, yours is that." Okay, fine, as long as they are happy with one another and don't run around and try to force me to become like them. Okay. And yeah, I see your hand, Barbara, just a second. And for those evangelicals who are the nationalist evangelicals and want America to become a Christian country, then some of the folks who are talking to the Jews should get over and talk to them and say, cut it out. There are other religions here. And I mean, there are some places where you can do it with Muslims. The problem, of course, with the Muslim is that they never had their enlightenment. I mean, they had their enlightenment from 700 to 1100. That was their Renaissance. And then it all went in hiding. And so that's a tough nut to crack. I mean, I know I have dear friends who are, Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And the point is, the Jew and the Christian could understand modern Bible studies. The Muslim could not, because they have no paradigm for that. And it sounds like it's heresy, to interpret your sacred source in a way that is different from how it has been since its founding. Okay, so that's a big challenge. Okay, who had their hand up? Oh, Barbara, yeah.
Yeah, when the TBA group was in Bosnia, we had a session with the Muslims. We had half a dozen of them. I think it was 6, not 7. And there were 2 imams there, and we met with them before dinner. We all prayed. They prayed first. We prayed second. There was a remarkable difference, but that has nothing to do with what I'm going to say. Their praying was quiet. Ours was very vocal, singing.
You mentioned that once before, yes.
Yeah. But I mean, to me, it just was our meeting with them. We ate dinner with them and then met again. And and we were just able to talk to them about anything, and then there was no topic that they seemed to object to, or that we objected to, and it was the best getting together of two different religious groups I've ever been associated with.
Good.
And then the second comment I was going to make
Where was this?
In Bosnia.
Okay, I mean
Bosnia-Herzegovina.
Right. I mean, so just keep in mind that's in Europe, though, and I don't know the degree to which, I don't know how Christians in Bosnia are relating to Jews. Is there?
Well, it's a much more Muslim country than it is Christian.
Okay, all right.
And then the second thing is that, to me, the worst anti-Semitism that I've ever faced is what's going on, or was going on. Now it seems to have settled down because of Hamas and Israel. I mean, I just can't understand how even Jewish students have been fighting against us, even though it was Hamas that came onto Israeli land and killed 1,200 people.
Yeah.
How any person can possibly feel that it was Israel's doing a bad thing by protecting its borders and protecting its people I just don't understand that.
Right.
And that to me is pure anti-Semitism.
Well, you're right. But I think part of the problem, I can speak to the Jewish community, and I've been talking about this for a long time. It's hard to break through this thing. It is that, I'll be very blunt. We have, as a Jewish community, the larger percentage of the Jewish community in the United States has lost Israel has moved away from the center of its concern. Now, maybe October 7 will push it back there again. We're hoping so. Sometimes it takes something like that to do that. But I'm just saying that for example, the number of children who are enrolled in Jewish schools of any kind has dropped. Forget about the Orthodox world, okay? Because that's driven by different value systems. A lot of it is good, some of it's problematic, but that's a different system. But Pressman Academy teaches Zionism, right? There's no question, okay? Clear. But there are many day schools that have diminished that. But the day school education in the Jewish community is a minority group. Religious schools in the modern communities are diminishing.
It was virtually non-existent when you and I were young.
What was? Day schools were.
Day schools.
I went to a Jewish day school, though. I was lucky.
You did?
Oh, yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, there was nothing like that in San Francisco.
Oh, I understand. But my point is, they're here now.
Which one did you go to?
Me? Here? Well, when I in elementary school, I went through sixth grade at the California Hebrew Academy, and then in junior high, I went to the Los Angeles Hebrew Junior High School, not the Hebrew High, and then I continued while I was in high school and college at the University of Judaism. Then I became a rabbi. What else? Okay, now you know why.
Sorry to interrupt.
High school at UJ? Really?
Yeah. All right. But my point, though, is that this whole the role of Israel, the centrality of Israel in the Jewish tradition is largely unknown by our own people. Okay, I mean, I did I use this, what I'm about to share with you. I use this in teaching. If you daven 3 times a day, you're a traditional Jew, forget about denomination. You do the traditional davening, whether it's in shul or by yourself. Every day, you get a minimum of 30 references to either Israel or Zion, or our land, or our holy land. 30 each day, okay? Now, multiply that by 365 days, that means you get somewhere between 10 and 11,000 touches by Israel every year. All right? That is going to put Israel in the center of your identity as a Jew. And I don't think there's anybody, but let's even say you don't do it that much. Let's say you go to shul every Shabbos. You'll go to daily meeting occasionally. All right? Let's say Friday night, Shabbos, you do Birkat Hamazon. Okay, so it's not tens of thousands. But even that, if you take all that stuff seriously, then you're going to be in touch with Judaism on a regular basis, with Israel on a regular basis of your life. Okay, so I mean, at Beth Am, just as an example, Armenians, everybody knows, when we finish on every weekday or Shabbos, right now we're singing Hatikvah. We didn't used to do that, because, you don't sing the American, our anthem either all the time. But the point is, we felt there was a need for us to clearly articulate who we are, right? Whether that's going to continue after all this settles, if it ever does. I see Margaret, I see your hand, just a second. Okay. But I mean, that's the sort of thing. It was a natural thing. Nobody yelled, hey, no, that doesn't belong here. Nobody did that. Everybody we sing Hatikvah. We have an Israeli flag in our synagogues. Always have. That's part of our tradition. Well, that's the way Judaism should operate. Okay. Yeah. And when you
Temple
do that,
Isaiah,
and you get this, and this becomes part of your culture, then you understand Israel is important. Okay. But we knew my friend Ari Kelman, who's a professor of Jewish social studies at Stanford University 20 years ago, was already saying that the young people, the young Jews in America are not getting enough. They don't feel a connection to Israel. It wasn't that they hate it. They just are neutral. That's the problem. That was
Shimona's doing a teaching. Assistant teaching, yeah.
Margaret had her hand up. All right, but anyway, that's just an example of what I was talking about. Margaret,
I know, but
you can't unmute. I can do it. I think I can. Well, let me see.
It's at the top of your thing.
I got it. Sorry. Okay. I just wanted to say something which is, I think, sort of a phenomenon of the 20th century, and that is the prevalence in European and really Western thinking about the socioeconomic and political phenomena of the last, say, 5 centuries of expansionism and the resultant backlash against so-called colonialism, which sometimes is colonialism and sometimes is just this a leftist agenda and I mean a Marxist agenda. I don't mean to disparage leftism or anything, but I think that the vogue of that idea or of those sentiments, which has prevailed for decades now, at least since the mid 20th century, requires all these students and intelligentsia to place any geographic phenomenon within that prism. And so there's this double curse or double challenge, really, right? Not only is it an anti-Semitism rather, but also just this, well, Israel itself is part of this whole global phenomenon that we're trying to overturn. And there's a really simplistic vision of Israel, I think, as a result of that.
Yeah.
So I think that's a big challenge. So I think it's a big current challenge. It's a current challenge.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's a very valid point. Yeah. And I don't think enough American Jews have the history of Israel in front of them. They don't know how to respond when they're confronted by an argument. How many people, I wonder how many Jews in America know why the year 2000 was a horrible year for the state of Israel? Why was the year 2000 a horrible year? Tybal.
Because as I learned in the fall of 1974, I said about directed studies in one of my directed studies class, that there was anticipation that there was going to be another apocalyptic event, because in theory it was the 1,000-year point, and certain kinds of Christian belief, all sorts of things were going to happen, which meant the Jews who hadn't become, I forget what the term is, whatever, hadn't joined the new covenant, blah, 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 the supersessionists were going to be the target.
All right, okay. No, that's interesting. I didn't know about that. No, I was saying something very concrete with respect to Israel, specifically. Something happened in the year 2000 that literally changed the course of history in the Middle East.
In the year or before the year that they were worried before?
No, that year, 2000.
Oh, okay.
Was it something to do with the U.S. administration?
No.
No. Okay.
Don't know.
Yasser Arafat said no.
To a proposed accord.
Exactly.
Right. And that was Clinton's.
Right. Clinton, the end, what happened was, and Dennis Ross wrote the book, and you've got to read that book. Dennis Ross is a brilliant student and participant in history. He was part of Clinton's team working that negotiation. He was there. Okay? So he will tell you, and he does in his book, number one, there were no maps that were drawn up. Everybody says, but the map that the Israelis were offering required two separate entities in the West Bank and great separation, and nobody in their right mind would accept it. And that's what everybody says. I have dear friends who assume that was the reason why Arafat said no. But if you read Dennis Ross's book, you learn there were no official maps. All this was oral discussion. And there were 3 stages to that. And finally, with Clinton's pressure, Barak agreed basically to a return of like 97% of the West Bank to the Palestinians, including, land swaps. Okay, so, Efrat and Ariel would stay in, but you get a chunk of here and a chunk of there, whatever it was. And there were no maps of it, but they discussed what that would entail. And they agreed, the negotiators agreed, and Barak said, okay. And Yasser Arafat's advisors told him, take the deal. That plus Gaza, you get that. Take the deal. And he couldn't. Whatever the reasons, he couldn't. And the next day began the Second Intifada. And then you had the bombings, the suicide increased suicide bombings, and ultimately the rockets, okay? And all that spun off of that event. How many people know that?
Not many.
I remind you guys of that. I live with that every day when I think about Israel.
I've talked to people, I've talked to Israelis about that, and they say, no, that there was nothing legitimate on the table. There was nothing, and
are these liberals or right-wingers or left-wingers or both?
Left.
Yes. Well, the fact is, these are the extreme lefties, right, who don't know. I can tell you what happened right after that. There were a lot of people who were on the left. They didn't become hard right, but they became centrist. And in pain. I was ready to sit Shiva. Personally. I had been there during the period before that. We had a Pressman Academy from, I forgot when this began. I know it was in the early 90s. So we had a sister school that our middle school was connected with in Tel Aviv. So I was there for a month on sabbatical, and I went to that school like 4 times just to be there, And you walk into the school, and they had hanging on the walls large murals that the kids painted of Jews and Arabs in friendship. Okay, there was Arabic written here and there. And this was an all-Israeli school. There were no Arabs. But they took this whole effort very seriously. Okay, and it was wonderful. All right, and there was this sense that maybe something big could happen. And then it all went up in the smoke. I mean, literally. And that's where we are today. Now, it doesn't mean that how that was going to be implemented would be quick and easy. No, it would have been challenging. And what was interesting, and again, a lot of people don't know this, there were a group of young bureaucrats trained in Europe, Arabs, Palestinians, who went to schools in the United States and Europe and got bachelor's and master's degrees, and were really, when this was really an operation and Arafat, was letting people do what they wanted to do, while he was running, actually, at the same time running around saying, well, now we got Jerusalem, just wait. Okay, I mean, that was a big issue, that his mouth did not match what the public was getting. And he would speak in Arabic in places and say these things, and nobody picked up on that. A few people did. Anyhow, but the point is, you had this sense that this was developing, this was growing, this could be a reality. Okay, and then it was gone. And that, in my mind, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't see how I could be wrong. Tony Blair from England was working as a go-between between Israel businesses, Israeli and Palestinian West Bank businesses, talking about cooperative efforts. I remember there was an article written by a guy, a reporter for the Jerusalem Post, for Haaretz, who worked in the West Bank, and he would report from the West Bank, and he said, this is amazing. He went into Ramallah and parked his car in a no parking zone, and a policeman came up to him and said, sorry, sir, I'm going to have to give you a ticket. And he said it was the first time ever that there was a police force actually enforcing the law in Ramallah. Okay, this was like in 1998 or 99, I forgot, something like that. But the Apex sponsored a presentation from him. And he said, there's a change that has taken place there. They're taking law and order seriously, which they never did before. This was internally. Didn't happen. So that's my point. People don't know that. People don't know the meaning of November 1947. Does that date ring a bell?
It's the year before the State of Israel.
Right.
And they were at war at that point.
Well, but the Declaration of Independence was in May of 48.
Right.
But that
you said 47.
That would never have happened unless what I'm talking about happened. Heibel?
Is that a reference to Kaftet in November?
Yes. What is that?
Well, it's now a street name. It was so important. It's now a street name in Jerusalem.
Why was it important?
That's what I think you just said, that it was November 1947.
I just am wondering, Rabbi Ann Taiba, why was it important? I want to hear.
Oh, no, that's the United Nations Declaration that called for the creation of a Jewish state and an Arab state.
Okay.
And that was on the basis of that. Ben Gurion got to work, and in May he said, "We accept."
Okay.
We will. It was not a good map at all.
Mm-hmm.
That's the partition. Thank you, Tybel. Right. It was a bad map, but he accepted it because it was something. At least he had the world behind him at that time. And then the war broke out. And then, as I say,
I was only 9.5. I didn't know.
That's no excuse. So, I mean, okay, but the point is, that's a significant date. And that's the point that, Israel took it seriously, but the Arab world refused to buy it. And that's when it all began. I mean, it had been percolating. A lot of difficulty was percolating before. But if the Arab world would have said, okay, fine, we'll get together and create a Palestinian state. But no, they didn't, because it wasn't the issue of creating the state. It was the issue of destroying the Jewish state. And that remains the goal of Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran, right? And we don't know how many other groups. That's more important. I mean, that's ultimately I don't know if that's what was behind. I think Arafat, he just knew that if he in 2000 did what they wanted him to do, he would lose power, because it would clearly shift from state destruction, which he had been doing since who knows when, teaching. That was his message up until that point, even though he agreed to discuss.
Yeah, I think that's what
But
happened
that,
there too.
that was the discuss. That was where he was, and now suddenly it would be shifting to state building, and he didn't know how to do that. It scared him. Okay.
Yeah, I think that was the problem for Arafat. He didn't want to lose power.
Yeah. All right, guys. Let me see. I think we're late.
Yeah.
There we are.
Oh boy.
We had a good time. That's why we're
Just
here.
briefly,
Yeah.
Anyway, now that we have defined the problems of the world,
How do we solve?
well, just briefly, when we were talking about Jewish schools, Shimona is now being an assistant teacher at the Isaiah preschool.
yes,
Temple Isaiah
good for her.
Reform Synagogue.
Bravo.
And it's amazing because she says they're teaching these kids like as if they were at a Beth Am school. I mean, really Jewish, and they have Friday services for the kids.
Good.
In the individual classes, they bring in challah and grape juice, and then the whole class, the whole school gets together. I mean, these are 2 to 5 year old kids. She loves it because they sit there and they sing Jewish songs and stuff like that.
That's wonderful. Yeah, Tybal wants
They
to
have a lot of.
I just wanted to, I put it in the chat, but it'll be on the recording. Many years ago, I did the in-person program at Yad Vashem to become a Shoah educator. And one of the things I learned that I didn't know, even though it's in my town, that there's something called memory. The acronym is MEMRI.
Yes.
And what they do is listen and watch and read Arabic news sources and translate it to English. And it's really the only source to catch things like the total contradiction. So number one, their materials are online, but number two, are people in a position to support them. They're a 501c3. It's MEMRI.org. I am not on the board. I don't work for them. I have no other interest, but I learned about it at Yad Vashem as part of a Holocaust.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, it's a good thing.
One other question. Which Dennis Ross book were you talking about?
Oh, hold on.
I think it's the missing piece.
What?
A missing piece.
That may be it.
The missing piece, as in PEACE.
Yeah, I think that's
Yeah,
it.
we figured.
Thank you. Thank
Yeah,
you.
sorry.
No, that's great.
It could have worked either
Good
way.
book.
That was clever.
No, it's a very responsible book. Yeah, absolutely. All right, guys, this has been great. We will continue. Spend a little bit more time talking. I'm going to give you some examples of some blood libel. There are 2 cases in the Middle Ages that were critical in the perpetuation. We talked about the process. These 2 cases, one of them you've already heard about, this thing in Trent, but there's another one elsewhere before that, and they really pushed from popular perspective, that whole thing. So we'll pick up on that again.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.